A few days ago, I went with Brian to an early screening of Star Wars The Last Jedi, and let me tell you, it was pretty tello epic! Oh, Star Wars is a product of our culture! Oh, everybody loves Star Wars so much! Oh, I got so hyped for this movie that I ripped my fucking dick off in order to sell early screening tickets so I could see it on Thursday instead of Friday. Oh! Aside from that, it was kind of disappointing. Now, I'll admit that I'm not the biggest fan of Star Wars, but I've got a great appreciation for its influence on pop culture. And hell, I like the original trilogy, and I really like Force Awakens. But as for this movie in particular, I went in with a blank slate because over the past few years, that aura for me has faded away. Although this franchise is a staple of pop culture, Star Wars in its own right is the product of its own hype. People are gonna love or hate this movie based on the hype culture mentality that surrounds it, and less on their impact as just movies. And no matter how many people whine and bitch and moan about how shitty this movie was, they're still gonna flock in droves to see the next one. Because that's just what Star Wars is. Now, as a movie, there was a great deal about this that I liked. The effects, especially for action scenes, were pretty well done and didn't take away from the overall movie. It helped to service world building and action scenes in situations where it would otherwise be extremely difficult or downright impossible. The performances were all pretty good, with Adam Driver as Kylo Ren doing exceptionally well. There were conversations with him and Daisy Ridley as Rey that I felt carried some legitimate tension. The score was fine yet somewhat forgettable, and the cinematography was decent with a few excellent shots. And I really did appreciate that the film wasn't trying to hit the same beats as the original trilogy, since it was the biggest gripe that most people had about The Force Awakens. Now, let's go to the not so good. I think the biggest problem that this movie had was its inconsistency. For one, the movie at times didn't know what it wanted to be. There were moments where one thing a character said or a small thing that happened would create a complete tonal shift that threw me out of the film for a moment. For the most part, this came from the humor. And by humor, I mean a marketing executive holding Rian Johnson at gunpoint saying, "You add wacky, zany one-liners to all the characters in the movie, or I swear we burn the script and blow your fucking brains out. They don't even have to fit the scene, just throw that shit in there." And so they threw that shit in everywhere. When a movie with a completely serious tone tries to throw humor into every scene, it breaks the tension and throws away your suspension of disbelief. A good example of this would be one of the conversations between Kylo and Rey. They had done like one or two of these completely focused and meant to be taken seriously dialogues, and because in this one Kylo didn't have a shirt on, Rey is like, "Ew, you need to put a shirt on." And Kylo's all, no I don't." And she's all like, "Yeah you do, anyway, blah 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 blah." And that was the movie. There were like 5 or 10 moments like that where it didn't know what it wanted to be, and it just had to sneak in a joke for the general dumb movie-going crowd at the consequence of the film. Another thing was its pacing. Some scenes would just jump all over the place. It didn't help that there were like 5 or so different subplots you had to pay attention to in order to piece the whole thing together, which in some spots it didn't. As well, there were some missed opportunities and good moments. Like when Chewbacca reunites with Luke, Luke figures out that he was piloting the ship and asks what happens to Han Solo, and then it just immediately cuts to a different scene and it was never brought up again. You couldn't have paused for a moment or two to let the emotional weight of Luke learning of Han's death sink in? Or hell, even have one of them directly explain it instead of having no bearing on anything? Which brings me to another point. The Force Awakens tried to set so many things up that this movie did absolutely nothing with. Some characters and plot lines border between inconsequential to downright worthless. Like, remember that very important scene where Finn and Rose went to Casino World in order to find a guy to help turn off the beacon thingy, only to be captured and thrown in jail, and then rescued by a Randy who ends up coincidentally being a hacker man who saves them and eventually turns them into the First Order? Wasn't that so cool? Hey, at least they got to save the ugly horse dog thingies and miraculously fall in love in the process after only knowing each other for like 1 fucking day. And Snoke ended up being less of a character and more of a plot device for Kylo to earn redemption, only to bait and switch the audience twice in the same fucking scene. So it turns out those serious dialogue scenes between Kylo and Rey was just Snoke manipulating their minds in order for Rey to essentially turn herself in. And when she gets to the ship, Snoke's like, "You've been a bad girl, now tell me where Skywalker is." And she's like, "No." So instead of killing her himself, he takes her lightsaber and turns her over to Kylo in hopes that he'll kill her. And instead of doing so, the movie explicitly spells out what's about to happen by having Kylo turn the lightsaber around and slice Snoke in half. And instead of assuming that Kylo is now good, it essentially tells you that good and evil still exists, with Kylo being inherently bad and Rey being pure and innocent of heart. Even though Kylo outright tells her that she comes from nothing and is nothing. Like, wouldn't it be more interesting and different to see what would happen if she did join his side? Like, if they were able to kill the past because of their similar hatred of stuff that happened to them before and they have no idea what they're doing alone? But no, they have to do the whole "no, you're bad" shtick before they go their separate ways again. So not only did they kill the Supreme Leader, who was the main conflict of interest in the story, but they killed off what could have been the most interesting aspect of the next movie with Rey and Kylo's developing connections. And as for one subplot in particular, it fell completely flat. So after Kylo initially returns to Snoke after killing Han and failing to capture Rey, Snoke calls him out for being a little bitch. So Kylo snaps, gets in his ship, and flies directly to Leia. He has his sights locked onto her and looks to kill her, but it cuts back to show both of their reactions. Like the Force is there and connects them. She knows of his intention, and he almost seems to see the consequence of what he's about to do before hesitating. But some other fighters blow the ship up and it explodes, killing the crew and launching her and them into space. So naturally thinking, well damn, it's a pretty harsh send-off with Carrie Fisher being gone, but at least it makes sense with Kylo being too weak to do it himself. But the film immediately reverses it by cutting to her lifeless body awaking in the vacuum of space before she floats back to the gaping hole in the ship like Mary fucking Poppins before passing out again. I get that it was implied this whole time that she had the Force, including the scene you just fucking showed us 1 minute ago, but there was no subtlety to that. Even if she was strong with the Force, there's nothing that tells me how she could have survived that. So she survives an explosion that could have disintegrated her and the airless vacuum of space, but the Emperor somehow died by falling down a big hole. It was kind of embarrassing, and I started laughing in the quiet theater. A scene like this shouldn't be the thing you remember most from a movie, but making this review and even in the middle of watching it, I could not stop thinking about it. Now obviously it's not their fault that they can't expand upon this plot point given the circumstances, which sure does give that insurance payment a good reason to be a thing, but upon noticing this and the choices actively made with the story, I'm interested to see what happens next. Not in the intended way like Force Awakens, but in the way of what can they do next? Snoke is dead, Luke is dead, the woman playing Leia is dead, Rey and Kylo didn't join forces, Rey and Finn didn't fuck. So what are they gonna do now? On the whole, the movie let me down in a lot of ways, but I still had some fun. If you like Star Wars, nothing in this review is going to persuade you otherwise. It has its flaws, but it's nowhere close to being the worst Star Wars film. Remember these fucking piles of shit? I'll definitely be seeing the next one, but if this taught me anything, it's that it's alright not to go in with the expectation that something is going to be good because it's the way it's supposed to be. Or that porks are fucking gay. Let's just hope the next movie learns from this one. But something in my gut tells me no. 6 out of 10.